if you think about what got me in trouble in the first place was a universal problem, which is that we all have a voice in our heads. We all have this inner narrator. It chases us out of bed in the morning and is yammering at us all day long, and is constantly, telling us that we should want stuff or not want stuff, judge people, judge ourselves, think about the past or think about the future instead of what's happening right now. And this voice is what got me to war zones without thinking about the consequences. Then it got me home and depressed and insufficiently self-aware to know that I was depressed. And then I blindly reached for recreational drugs, and it all blew up in my face. And what meditation does or it does many things, but one of the primary benefits is that it allows you to have a different relationship to your thoughts and your emotions so that you're not so owned by them.
Welcome to Something More Human. I'm Sam.
And I'm Elliot.
Post-pandemic, it feels as though our social skills have atrophied.
It feels like the barrier to entry to meeting new people and cultivating community is higher than ever before, but we believe that meaningful relationships are the key to a fulfilling life.
So we're ditching the surface level conversations to ask and answer questions all about human connection. Join us in creating something more human.
Dan Harris, retired journalist for ABC News. You were the anchor of Nightline, the co-anchor of Good Morning America, covered the war in Iraq. You've tracked rhino poachers. You've posed as a customer in order to expose child slave traders in Haiti. You subjected yourself to 2 days in Denver in solitary confinement in the county jail to report the effects of, the deplorable conditions.
Yep.
This year, you're celebrating the 10th anniversary of your #1 New York Times bestselling book, 10% Happier. Your husband, clearly you are a father to a human child, but also 3 feline children. You're a Beatles fan.
Yes.
You, I think, are still a smoothies lover, as far as I know.
Every day that I am at home, I make a smoothie. Yes.
So yeah, you've definitely done it all. You've been around, and
Welcome.
yeah, welcome.
Thank you.
A little bit about kind of the show and why we're so excited to have you here. Post-pandemic, I mentioned in the elevator, it feels like our social skills have atrophied. There's this desire to get back out there, and it kind of feels like the barrier to entry is now higher than it's ever been before. So that was really the impetus for us starting this show. And we've heard you talk on your podcast, which is also called 10% Happier, about the friendship crisis in America. We really think that deep and meaningful relationships are kind of the skeleton key for a fulfilling, satisfactory life. And something that we often overlook when it comes to being a better parent, being a better friend, being a better colleague, boss, leader, whatever it may be, is that in order to do that, it kind of starts with the self. So we've asked you here kind of to make the case why everybody needs meditation in their life, even if this person thinks it's a kind of a crock of crap. Can you talk about your pivotal moment on Good Morning America? We're going back to 2004.
Yeah.
And why it's led you here nearly 20 years later to being a key voice in the field of meditation, mindfulness, and really personal development.
Happy to talk about that. I would say that I actually, on your setup comment, I also have some comments, but I will, I'll get back to that.
Okay.
Oh, sure. Great.
In terms of how I got into meditation, it's reasonably well known, so I'll keep this quick. If you Google panic attack on live television, the #1 result will be me freaking out on Good Morning America back in 2004 when I was a young and ambitious network news reporter. The backstory is that I had spent a lot of time after 9/11 in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I gotten depressed, even though I didn't know I was depressed. I felt like I had a kind of low-grade illness all the time, and I was having trouble motivating, getting out of bed. And in the midst of this period, I did something incredibly dumb, which is I started to self-medicate with recreational drugs. Not in a, if you've ever seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, it was not like that. It wasn't crazy, but it was enough, according to my psychiatrist, to change my brain chemistry and make it more likely to panic. And so that's what happened on Good Morning America. And that kind of set me off. Well, first of all, I stopped doing any drugs, and I started getting really into therapy. And through that process, I stumbled upon meditation. And I sometimes joke that it was like the first time in my life I've ever been ahead of a trend, because I started to get interested in meditation before it took off. The reason why I got interested was the science that shows that, I was a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic and raised by atheist scientists in the People's Republic of Massachusetts, and I was like not into this at all. But there's all of this data that strongly suggests that a little bit of meditation every day can lower your blood pressure, boost your immune system, and literally rewire key parts of your brain that are associated with self-awareness, focus, compassion, stress. And so that was really compelling. And it was really a way to go at what got me in trouble in the first place. If you think about it, what got me in trouble in the first place was a universal problem, which is that we all have a voice in our heads. We all have this inner narrator that chases us out of bed in the morning and is yammering at us all day long, and is constantly, telling us that we should want stuff or not want stuff, judge people, judge ourselves, think about the past or think about the future instead of what's happening right now. And this voice is what got me to war zones without thinking about the consequences. Then it got me home and depressed and insufficiently self-aware to know that I was depressed. And then I blindly reached for recreational drugs, and it all blew up in my face. And what meditation does it does many things, but one of the primary benefits is that it allows you to have a different relationship to your thoughts and your emotions so that you're not so owned by them. So that's my origin story. I then wrote a book about it called 10% Happier, and at the time I was still a fully employed ABC News anchor, and the whole meditation stuff kind of swallowed my life. I've written more books and have a podcast, and for a while had a meditation app, and so it's been an interesting side hustle. And then I retired from ABC News to do this full time.
And that was in 2021 that you retired?
Yeah.
So pretty recently.
Yeah.
The application, is it not yours anymore? Or is it just not an application anymore?
September 10th, we're going to announce that because of some internal creative and interpersonal and financial differences that I'm no longer part of the app, which has been very hard for me.
Yeah.
It's been a huge ordeal. So I'm going to go public with this and talk about, like what I learned in this process. And then I'm starting something new.
I'm sure you want to keep that under wraps for now,
No,
right?
I could tell you. Basically taking my podcast to the next level. My podcast has been around. We have 8 years, 700 episodes.
Jeez.
We've talked to, basically everybody in this space. And right now we dump these nutrient-dense episodes on people and then move on. So now we're going to create a place where we can give you, if you sign up, you get a cheat sheet that summarizes the major points, and a community where you can talk to me and the expert and the producers and each other about, what to do based on what you've just learned. And then also monthly AMAs with me on video and a bunch of other stuff.
That's incredible.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So for anyone that's read your book, it's obvious. And for those that haven't, I'll just recap that some of the things that really have stood out to us are sort of your candor, your hilarity, your openness to being fully skeptical. And I think that piece is really what speaks to so many people is meditation is really awesome. And for those that feel like maybe it's too woo-woo for them, there's actually still a space for them.
Yes.
You've given a TED Talk.
Which, congratulations, by the way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's pretty cool.
You've written a book. Congratulations on the 10th anniversary. You have created an entire brand around meditation, but you started, and I'll read a quote from your book, thinking that meditation was really the distillation of everything that sucked hardest about granola lifestyle. So we're excited to bridge the gap between skepticism and just leaning in a little bit to the woo and to there is scientific research.
Yeah.
Tons, yeah.
Elliot and I just got back from Podcast Movement, which is one of the largest podcasting conferences. And we had the pleasure of seeing Rachel Martin interview Ira Glass as a keynote.
That's cool.
You just had her on the podcast.
Yeah, I did.
So we were unbelievably inspired by the way that Rachel conducts herself as an interviewer, the way that she is building her show really around the human experience. And that's kind of exactly the kind of host that we aspire to be. So we have a couple of questions for you that are a little bit more about your just experience going about the world, a little less of how I built this or how do you meditate, but you, Dan Harris, just the human.
Sure.
What's a recent moment that a stranger made a deep impact on you?
I have to think about that. Oh, yes, I've got a good one.
Oh, great.
Great.
Sorry, it took me a second. I actually made a little video about this on Instagram. I have panic disorder. I've made no secret of that. I mean, I had a panic attack on national television, kind of launched my quasi self-help guru career. And it was actually kind of almost entirely under control for a long time. And then in the last couple of years, in part because I've been going through, some business turmoil, it really came back. And I've been really struggling on elevators and in airplanes, which is really embarrassing because, I feel like not that I've ever presented myself as some sort of perfected guru and my whole brand is 10% happier, but like still, I'm supposed to be Mr. Meditation, and I've had to like walk off planes or take the stairs because I can't get on the elevator. And I showed up recently to do a podcast at an office building in Manhattan, and I had luggage with me, and I looked at the elevator and it was really small, and I was like, I don't think I can get in this. And I turned to the security guard and I said, "Can I take the stairs and you bring my luggage up?" And he said, "I'm going to ride with you." And he held my hand and he rode with me to the 14th floor. His name is Barry.
Serious?
Yep. And he was like, "I got you." And he talked to me the whole time about where he's from. He's from some country in Africa that I've forgotten. And it was just a great example that if you take advantage of a small opportunity to be cool to somebody, it can have a huge impact.
Yeah.
And it really, I don't know what I would have done if he hadn't helped me.
Huff your way up 14 flights of stairs, I
guess.
guess.
But sometimes these buildings don't have stairs.
Wow.
So I might have missed it. And he was so nice about it. He just like sized me up, realized that I was in trouble, and was like, "I got you." Like put his coat on, he put his blazer on. He's like, "No, we're going to do this together."
So were you kind of forthcoming about your like anxiety about this little small elevator?
Yeah.
It seems like, I just interesting. This meditation seems to have like manifested in so many ways, because that, especially for men, I feel like that's a pretty, or potentially for some, that's a pretty like vulnerable thing to admit, or might be embarrassing to admit. Like, I don't want to get on an elevator and go 14 floors, but you were readily willing and wanting to admit that like this is a thing, this is a problem for me.
Yeah.
Do you think that meditating has made things like that, situations like that, easier for you to just be open and honest and hope?
I mean, I really don't have a choice.
Okay. Okay.
I don't. It's embarrassing. I mean, I'm a stereotypical male in many ways, and we don't like admitting vulnerability in that way. I definitely am more comfortable with it as I've gotten older, and I think meditation is part of it. And hosting a podcast of this length where I'm I'm learning about the value of being honest and open and things like that. So, but it doesn't come naturally to me. So I'm certainly not excited to do it.
Sure. Yeah. This flows into the next question actually perfectly. In your TED Talk, you mentioned the aspects that you were most afflicted by, which is something that you actually, came out on TED Talk and sort of talked about it for the first time, was that your anger and self-centeredness.
Yeah.
And how meditation helped you become less angry and more giving and compassionate. And the question is, where do you think, we could talk about that, but where do you think those things come from? Is it just, do you think it's built in, or is it also a combination of genetics and your actual upbringing? Like where does that come from, in your opinion, or for you specifically?
I mean, think about it. There's a reason why we've, for millennia, talked about aspects of our personality as things like demons. And I think that's just a recognition in many cultures that we do wrestle with different parts of our personality, and it's even been validated in modern psychological science, where they talk about the modular model of mind, that we have these different modes. Jealous mode, happy mode, generous mode, whatever. And they're each kind of competing for salience in the mind, like tiles in a magic 8-ball. And so we all have different parts of our personality. And for me, I have many parts, but I would say the two demons with which I wrestle the most are anger and self-centeredness or selfishness. And these are very common things, but it's embarrassing to say it out loud. But I think my big part of my job is to say things out loud. There's a term I heard that I didn't coin it, and I don't know who said it, but cathartic normalization.
Sure.
Like there's some service you can do by just talking about embarrassing shit.
Right.
It's just really, it gives everybody else permission to get comfortable with their stuff, which they know they have,
Right.
but they probably don't want to admit,
Right.
even to themselves. And so if I can get up as a seemingly functional human being who's done a few things in his life and be like, yeah, I struggle with anger, I struggle with self-centeredness, I have panic disorder, but here's what I'm doing about it.
Right.
And I think that's key. I think we have a little too much kind of anxiety porn going on social media right now, where people
I love
are
that.
just marinating in the suffering of it. But so I think that's only 50% of it. I think half the battle is to just normalize the fact that anxiety and panic are real. The other half is to talk about what you can do about it.
Right.
And so that's the recipe I'm shooting for.
This is, in my opinion, like relatability, right? I think that the more open you can be, and you're talking about being, embarrassed to open up, but you're saying it gives people permission. And I kind of wanted to touch a little bit on relatability. This is a very specific instance, but on your first retreat, you were talking to Spring, and she told you that everyone around you, because when you were there, you were like at this retreat, the 10-day retreat this is the first retreat that you did years back. You're basically suffering. It was very difficult for you to get through, and it seemed like everybody else was having a better time. But once she told you that everyone was sort of going through exactly what you were going through, you felt like way better about the rest of the time there. And I just think that there's a power to being relatable, and I think being open and vulnerable is part of that. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, there are two sides to this. There's the misery loves company side, which I think is a little negative. It's like you're in a bad mood, so you piss other people off so that everybody can be in a bad mood together. And then there's a problem shared is a problem halved part of it. I was talking to my wife hooked me up with this therapist the other day to help me with some fear I was having around flying out here, actually. Thank you to Alexander, who accompanied me. But anyway, I was talking to this therapist, and he was talking about how trauma, and that's a bit of an overused word, but trauma with a capital T, big trauma, and also small t trauma, just sort of the trauma of everyday life. Often the variable that dictates whether it's going to stay with you and do long-term damage is surprising. You can have a big capital T trauma like living through an earthquake, but not suffer long-term consequences if you feel that it's a shared experience. You can have a small t trauma like a breakup, but if you feel alone in it, it can dog you for a long time. And he said, and this I believe is a direct quote, disconnection is at the heart of it. And so I just think, given how we're wired as animals, from birth, we need a lot of help. And our species only was able to become the apex predator because we had this ability to cooperate and communicate and because we certainly weren't the strongest. So given how we're wired, it makes so much sense that we need each other. And it's what you said before at the top of this episode when you were kind of explaining the conceit of this show, that having deep and meaningful relationships is the recipe for a happy life. I don't think I'm nailing the language exactly, but that's an evidence-based assertion. It may sound to some like a Hallmark card,
Sure.
but it is incontrovertible. I mean, I'm sure you guys are aware of the Harvard study for adult development, which was run by this guy named Robert Waldinger, who you should have on the show. But this is the longest running study in the history of science. They've been following several generations of people in the Boston area for, I think, almost 90 years.
Wow.
Trying to figure out what are the most important variables when it comes to a long life, a healthy life, and a happy life. And there's just one data point that just comes screaming out of the whole thing, and it's the quality of your relationships. And what's the mechanism for that? Stress is generally what kills us, and the best way to mitigate stress is to be with other people, to have close relationships. As Robert Waldinger says, and I don't think this is his expression, but he's the only person I've ever heard say it. A great way to operationalize this insight is the following: never worry alone. And that is a great way to go through life.
Could you also say that, like, the trauma aspect, could you say, like, it sounds kind of weird, but as soon as you do experience that trauma, I know that you're feeling the trauma and you feel alone in the trauma, is it important to find someone who shares the same type of trauma to maybe overcome it quicker or to be less affected by it? Does that make sense?
I don't want to pretend I'm a trauma expert, but having done a lot of interviews on this, my sense is sure, it can be really important to be with somebody who's experienced the same trauma. That's why they have support groups of people who've lost children or whatever it is, or people whose parents are alcoholics. So that can be all very powerful. But I believe, my understanding is that the most important ingredient is an empathetic witness, just to be seen in whatever you're going through.
Right.
I'm curious about how this journey of sort of meditation and turning inward has impacted your close relationships. I know you've talked about when Alexander was 4, going on a trip to Boston together. He's here with you now. How has your framework and perspective for the way that you relate and hold space for and with the people close to you, how has that transformed over time?
I don't know that meditation per se is what changed it. So you saw the TED Talk about how I got a 360 review. For anybody who hasn't heard of a 360 review, it's basically an anonymous survey, usually done in the workplace, of your bosses, peers, and direct reports to get like a panoramic sense of your strengths and weaknesses. I did the crazy version where I added in my wife, my brother, and 2 of my meditation teacher friends. Alexander has pointed out on many occasions that I'm very lucky that he was not consulted as part of this 360 review. This was 6 years ago, so he was 4 at the time, or 3 at the time, actually, because he's 9 now. So the 360, there were some positive parts, but the negative parts were basically all about my relationships, that I was dismissive and stubborn and emotionally guarded and rushed and overcommitted, and this was damaging my relationships. And I was, let's do the math on that. I was 4 years into my career as a meditation evangelist, and I had been meditating for 5 years before that. So 9 years into meditation, and I still got this shitty 360 review. And so meditation, mindfulness meditation, it's in and of itself is incredibly useful and can have real benefits for your relationships. In fact, if you read the 360 review, people talk about how I was so much nicer post-meditation than I was pre-meditation, but I still clearly had a lot of work to do. It was after the 360 that I did a number of things to work on my relationships that I think have been transformative. One was upping the percentage or the dosage of a specific form of meditation called loving kindness meditation that we can talk about if you want. Another is getting very involved in communications training. So for 6 years, I've been working with these consultants who've written a book called Let's Talk. Their names are Dan Klerman and Mudita Nisker. And they basically just train you how to communicate. Because one of the interesting things is communication is the ultimate in the human experience, and yet nobody teaches you how to do it. And there are a bunch of pretty simple skills that we can talk about if you want that will help you have winning and successful conversations. But to get back to the question you asked about taking this guy we did our first father-son trip when he was 4. We went to visit his grandparents, my parents, in Boston together, and that really was the result of a different initiative I launched after the 360, which was just to reshuffle my priorities so that instead of waking up in the morning and thinking about, okay, what's on my work agenda? When am I going to get a workout? How am I going to get my meditation minutes in? I still do all of those things, but actively and daily working on the quality of my relationships, especially with my wife, with my son, is a much higher priority than it used to be. And so that trip with Alexander was the first time we'd ever taken a boys' trip. And now pretty much every time I give a speech, and I do a lot of them, this guy comes with me. And so our relationship has been transformed by that 360.
I want to come back to communication, but I want to dive into the 360. I know you're working on a new book. I know you're spending a lot of time on it. And the topic of it is this 360. When we think about meaningful relationships, there's conflict. We're humans. We fail each other. We're not perfect. And it can be difficult to have those conversations. I'm curious about the impetus for having this conversation in the format of a 360 review and what advice you might have for having those difficult conversations once you got the feedback.
Well, I mean, this is embarrassing. I didn't even think the 360 was going to be that bad. Like, so it's not like I went in such a high-minded way. The backstory is that I wanted to write a book about compassion and specifically loving kindness meditation, both of which I think have gotten an insufficient amount of airtime in the mindfulness revolution. And so me and my wife and my brother and my editor and my literary agent, basically my brain trust, we came up with this idea to do the 360 because we thought it would be a good narrative conceit to add on top of this book. But then the 360 itself was so devastating that I kind of went into the fetal position for a while and then realized I had a very different book on my hands, which is we're now 6 years later and I still haven't finished it because it was such a revelation, that I kind of stumbled into. But to answer your actual question, I mean, I think conflict is natural. Anytime you have more than one person in a room, conflict is inevitable eventually. And that's not necessarily bad. I mean, there is a difference between healthy conflict and destructive or unhealthy conflict. And healthy conflict is a skill that you can learn. And, you guys are married?
We're married, yeah.
You're married. Okay. So every marriage has its ups and downs. And you're going to rub up against each other in all sorts of uncomfortable ways and triggering ways.
Oh boy, do we know that.
We're very candid about forthcoming about that, yeah.
You both have your own personal histories. You have your own demons, your own ghosts, and you're going to trigger the other person's demons and ghosts inadvertently all the time. And then when the other person gets triggered, you get triggered. And as our couples counselor, Michael Vincent Miller, who has worked with me and Bianca, as he likes to say, when the ghosts take over, you're well and truly fucked. And so what you want to do is learn how to have a conflict style that emphasizes mutual understanding and resolution rather than victory and capitulation, which the latter style was mine for decades. Like I was that.
I saw that you posted something recently on Instagram in the last couple of weeks that was like, it's funny because these are like they're not really novel ideas when you think about them, but we rarely use them, which is so interesting and fascinating as a human being. But basically, you're talking about conflict and how to, there were 3 steps, and basically the first one was, do you know what I'm talking about? I'm getting
Is it the one with my cats fighting and I did a voiceover?
Yes, I think the first one is basically like letting the person know. Providing them with the positive results or the outlook of the conversation they're about to have.
This is great. And I don't want to take any credit for this. This comes from the aforementioned Dan Klurman and Mudita Nisker, who are amazing. Everybody should check out their book. They've been on my podcast. They're incredible. Their advice is when you're going into a hard conversation to state your positive intention. And that can sound a little anodyne or a little boring or a little twee, but just ignore that and just get at the heart of what it is. It is basically these rules that we're going to talk about, these rules for healthy conflict, are ways, if you think about it from the standpoint of brain science, in a conversation, you want to not trigger somebody's amygdala, so that's the part of the brain that's back here, the reptile brain, the old fight or flight part of the brain, and instead bring online the prefrontal cortex, which is rational and creative. So then that's the newer part of the brain, the part that really makes us human. And so these rules, like positive intention, which I'll talk about, are really about, if you can look at them through the lens of neuroscience, of brain science. We want to just stay in the prefrontal cortex and out of the amygdala. And one way to do that, especially when you're going into potentially choppy waters, is to start the conversation by saying, okay, this relationship is incredibly important to me. I want it to work. There's an issue I want to address. Are you open to discussing it? You could put it in your own language, but just by people relax when you say, like, I'm not coming in to, decimate the village.
Right.
I'm here because I love you, or I care about you, or this work relationship is super important. I want to make it work. I want this project to be a success. You're stating it in the positive, and you're establishing the importance of this relationship. Generally speaking, after that, people are really going to be willing to listen.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting about that is, like, that's part and parcel with mindfulness, right? Because we don't normally go there because right away we react.
Yes.
Like our conversations,
Yes.
like fights usually start.
Yes.
We never start with that. I never start with, okay,
I would say never is a little
almost
not
never
true.
But I feel like if I were more mindful, then I wouldn't let my emotions get the best of me. I would see them for what they are, and then I would respond accordingly with mindfulness. But as humans, we just go right to emotions. You know what I mean? So that's seemingly an easy thing to do, but very difficult in practice. But I guess with enough practice, it becomes easy.
There's a million things to say about that, because first of all, we should define mindfulness. Mindfulness is the word that gets used a lot, and often by people who don't know what they're talking about. But one basic way to understand it is the ability to see what's happening in your mind at any given moment without getting carried away with it.
Mm-hmm.
So just to restate that, the self-awareness, to have some sense of, like, what kind of thoughts and emotions and urges are flitting through your consciousness now,
Right.
so that you're not acting them out blindly.
Right.
It is a skill that can be developed through mindfulness meditation. But you're never going to be perfect at it unless you are enlightened. And I'm not even sure I believe in enlightenment, but if you're enlightened, you're 100% mindful. But for the rest of us, let's aim for 10% and call it a day. So you're still, Elliot, going to have moments where you get triggered and say something stupid. That is why the good Lord invented apologies.
This is true.
Because that's another option we have.
This is true.
But here's another technique from Dan and Mudita that I think actually kind of trains a conversational mindfulness, and it's called reflective listening.
She's good at that.
Are you?
Yes, she's really good at that. Sorry to interrupt. Yes.
No, not at all. I mean,
I'm hearing
kudos to you.
Yeah, she's great at it. But keep going.
So just for those of us who are not you and who need to hear this,
I think Elliot's just trying to butter me up, talking about how...
No, you are. You do it on the podcast. We have proof. We have video evidence.
It's documented.
Evidence.
Anyway,
but
go
he's
ahead,
hoping
Dan.
you'll cook dinner later. This is what this is about. Reflective listening is a kind of mindfulness in action where you are having a conversation with somebody, they utter a few paragraphs about whatever it is, and you state back to them in your own language what you've heard, the bones or the essence of what they've said. And this forces you to be mindful. It forces you, because you know you're going to do it, you have to listen very carefully. So you're mindfully listening. And then, as any good journalist, you're reporting back the headline. And this does a couple of things. One is it prevents you from just emotionally and automatically and habitually reacting to what the other person has said.
Right.
And second, it gives the other person what every human being wants, even though they don't know they want it, which is to be heard and seen.
Right.
And so it's just a panoramic win, the ultimate in manipulation techniques, but on the benevolent side of the spectrum. And I highly, highly recommend it.
I think that's something that we talk about often that's related to this is the power of language or the power of a question. And the art of curiosity in tandem with the atrophy of our social skills is just sort of on the decline.
Yeah.
And something that really stood out to us in your book was Mark Epstein telling you, "I want to know you."
Yeah.
And you saying, that's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me.
Yeah. Five very simple words to say to somebody. You know?
Easy to say, but not often said. And so do you have any ideas or considerations around his meditation or his practice being the impetus for saying those things out loud and being intentional with you? Or is that simply an independent muscle that over time we can work on building in these meaningful ways?
One of the I want to answer that. I'm just going to call out a dynamic in this conversation that's interesting, because you guys keep asking me about how my meditation has helped my relationships, which is a perfectly legitimate and terrific question. And I'm noticing that I'm bumping on it just because in my personal history, there were those 9 years of meditating, and then I got this 360 review that showed my relationships were really suffering.
Sure.
And so actually, and so it gets me thinking about Mark Epstein. There's Mark Epstein, who's a psychiatrist who lives and works in New York City and has written a whole bunch of books about the overlap between Freudian psychology and Buddhism. Mark has been meditating for decades, since the 60s. And I think for him, a huge shift came in getting interested in sort of the later forms of meditation. This is likely to piss off some Buddhist scholars, so I say this with some, I'm trying to be a little bit ginger about this, but there are forms of meditation, and in fact, the forms of meditation that I still practice that are, it's called Theravada meditation, or old school, literally old school Buddhism, that really focuses on mindfulness, you being aware of your breath, and then aware of the thoughts and emotions that arise when you get distracted, and then starting again. And it's a beautiful practice and really can benefit your relationships, because the more mindful you are, the less carried away by your emotions. So it really does go to relationships. But the later schools of Buddhism are much more focused explicitly on relationships. And Mark, in my next book, actually says to me that he thinks, after having read my 360, he's like, I think you've fallen into an old school Buddhist trap, which is that you're so focused on your relationship to your own mind that you're not focusing on your relationships to other people, which, by the way, is all a false dichotomy anyway. Your mind is vastly influenced by the quality of your relationships with other people. In fact, as you just heard me argue earlier, it's probably the most important influence. So this is just sort of a cognitive error I was making in my practice. And so with Mark, I do think, yes, Mark has been practicing meditation for a long time, but he's also a practicing therapist, and so is very much focused on the relational in a way that I wasn't. I was doing it in a kind of solo athletic pursuit, whereas life is a team sport. And if you're not practicing it that way, you're gonna get anxious and depressed. And I think that's why we're seeing record levels of anxiety, depression, suicide, addiction, and loneliness right now, because young people, and this is not a critique of young people, we've created a world, old people like me have created a world for young people where there's an insufficient amount of social interaction. We're over-engineering all the play dates. We are saturating children and young people in technology that's sort of inherently divisive, not only because you are on your device, but because the social media algorithms drive us away from each other, apart from one another. And so we have like a perfect storm for lack of, not to mention a global pandemic, we have like this perfect storm for lack of relationships. And that, I believe, is a major contributor to all of the anxiety and depression we're seeing abroad in the land.
Yeah. You've seen so much in life, like with your two eyes. And in the book, you talk a little bit about how, or your therapist talks a little bit about how, your coverage in some of these war-torn countries definitely probably had an impact on your psyche, and maybe part and parcel, part of the reason why you had a panic attack, maybe contributed to your panic attack, the things that you saw, and then going back to social media, I think that we've become so desensitized because we are subjecting ourselves to those kinds of things at an astonishing clip sometimes. If we're on Facebook or Instagram or something, Twitter for 8 hours, the chances of us seeing 150 stories in the span of 30 minutes that go all the way from, pain and death to animal loving and people getting married and, all these feelings, it's just super unnatural.
And you're doing it alone.
And you're doing it alone. That's a really good
so
point.
it's the disconnection that's at the heart of trauma is right there for you.
Yeah.
And so it's one thing, even when I was covering war zones, I had a really tight crew of people who I'm still really close to now. And so I think that gave me a lot of protection. But if you're staring at your phone at images from Ukraine all day or a big chunk of your day, well, that seems like a recipe for some real suffering.
For sure. Absolutely.
I am not intentionally leading you on this question, but we're kind of starting to go there. What do you think our world is missing?
I mean, I can't believe I'm going to say this because I am a dyed-in-the-wool anti-sentimentalist, and I swear a lot, and I come from Gen X, which was kind of nihilistically sarcastic, and I wouldn't say the world is missing this, but the world has an insufficient amount of it, and that is love. And I have very specific meaning of this word. I don't mean just like when the Beatles sang "All You Need Is Love." I mean, I love the Beatles, but you also need to go to the dentist. There's also, it's. However, if you understand love the way I do, which is our evolutionarily wired capacity to care, to give a shit, well, then the dentist actually counts. So that basically our relationships to ourselves, to strangers, to our family, to our pets, to our romantic partners, to people we work with, our relationship to the world, that is what I mean by love. It's a broad, capacious understanding of that word. And then understanding on top of it that those are all skills, trainable skills.
It's true.
Through meditation, loving kindness meditation, mindfulness meditation, the communication skills we've discussed, that is my argument. And that is what I think the world needs right now. And again, I hate being the type of person who's like, what does the world need right now? We need love. I mean, how annoying is that? Or how empty is that?
But it's really broad,
When you understand it the way I mean it, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Or I hope it makes a lot of sense. And I'll just close by saying, there's so many bugs in the human design. There's so many, our biases, our tendency to, our hardwired tendency toward greed and hatred. But there's one feature that makes me incredibly optimistic, which is that if you do good for other people, it makes you feel good.
Right.
That dude Barry who rode me up in the elevator, he was psyched. It felt good for him. It wasn't a pain in the ass thing. It was like that was probably the best thing he did that day. It was probably more important to him than it was for me.
For sure.
And that aspect of the human animal is what I think will take us toward salvation if we can get there.
Yeah.
So you talk a lot about the inner critic, right? And I think the way that we think about that and often talk about it is the inner narrator. Have you encountered people or had conversations with people that their thought patterning, they actually don't have an inner monologue?
Well, I've had one or two people say to me that they don't have an inner monologue, or by which I think, and I'm assuming you're talking about yourself here, by which you mean there's no running self-criticism. I don't have the data on this, but it seems anecdotally to be vanishingly rare.
Sure.
That's what I'm saying. And what I want to end with is that this is the best case for Buddhism and for meditation, that I kind of had an epiphany while finishing up your book in DC at the podcast movement, is Sam is less prone to sadness and depression and anger and all these self-critical thoughts because she doesn't have that inner voice, and because of that, it's easier for her to be in the present moment.
Yeah.
Naturally.
Yes.
Whereas me, if I'm in the present moment, it's me thinking about being in the present moment, and she's just in it.
Yes.
And so there's such a vast ocean between us in that way. And to me, it's the best example for meditation and for mindfulness, is that, that's why she is the way she is and why she's in such a good place, in my opinion. Not trying to just toot your horn like crazy, but
I accept it.
Because you don't have that inner critic. She really doesn't. And that's pretty fascinating. And like you're saying, it's such a small amount of people. that don't have that inner critic. You know what I mean? And I wish I knew the stats. I mean, how rare is it? I would assume it's got to be pretty rare, you know?
Well, just to be clear, Sam has thoughts, so she has an inner monologue.
Yes.
I just don't have like a narrator. It's so much more abstract than like a voice in my head. But it's not just like a ball of hot air up there.
Right. A narrator, that's interesting.
Like I don't have my own voice
do you ever
in
think,
my head.
I what I could really use right now is a cup of coffee, or I got to do this. Here's my to-do list. I mean, that's what I mean by an inner narrator, and I kind of assume you have some of that. What you may not have is you're
I'm a piece of shit.
Yes.
Nice, because that's exactly what I think about. But you probably never thought that.
It's more abstract. Like, for example, if you told me that you wanted to be called Danny, but you spell it Dannie, it would be significantly easier for me to remember your name that way because I see it spelled just in my brain, like a piece of paper or a whiteboard. It's not that I have my own voice in my head saying, oh, he spells it Danny, Dannie. It's extremely abstract and difficult to explain, but...
And I'm assuming that's why you didn't talk about it in the book very much, because there's probably not very many people like that even exist, you know?
I am not aware. I mean, I think what you're describing... I suspect there are two things going on here. You have a visual mind,
Sure,
which is in and of itself a thing, but that's a little bit separate from what you're really trying to point out is that you don't have an inner critic, or at least not a very prominent one, and that's what I think is quite unique. I think there are a lot of people who have visual, spatial minds and less linear verbal minds. Although I don't really know that, but this is all my suspicion.
Yeah. For the men, there's two excuses that you've talked about. One is that they don't have the attention span to meditate, and the other excuse is that they might lose their edge that makes them creative and, a go-getter, so to speak. What would you say to those people, those men?
I hear this from men and women and everybody in between, but I'll address it to men. But if you're worried that I'm too ADD to meditate or whatever, I think that's actually based on a misunderstanding of what meditation is. A lot of people think that it requires clearing your mind, but that's not a thing. You can't clear your mind, or most people can't clear their mind unless you're really, really good at meditation or you have a very unusual mind. The goal of meditation is just to sit quietly, try to focus on one thing, usually the feeling of your breath, and then every time you get distracted, you start again and again and again. And people think sometimes that distraction is proof that they're failing, but the distraction is actually proof that you're succeeding. Why? Because the whole goal here is not to reach some special state. It's to get more familiar with the voice in your head so that it doesn't own you as much. In terms of losing your edge, do you think you're going to have more or less of an edge if you're self-aware and self-regulated and the calmest person in a room in a hostile meeting? Do you think you're going to have more or less edge if you're more focused and less distracted? Do you think you have more or less of an edge if you're better able to maintain relationships in your life? I mean, the answer is self-evident. And there's a reason why elite athletes and CEOs and rock stars and pop stars are embracing this inner technology. It's because it enhances your edge. It's not like a hippy-dippy pastime, although you can do it that way if you want. But if you're like us, type A people active in the world, this is a great way to get even better. And I want to be clear, I don't think you have to do it, or I don't even use the word should. I'm sort of like dogmatically non-dogmatic. I think the evidence is there. It's pretty obvious. It's helped me. It's helped lots of people. My point is just to make the case that it's a tool that's there for you when you want it. And I kind of think about it like planting seeds. I mean, with this guy, Alexander doesn't meditate, but I don't force it on him. But he's around me, and he knows, he sees me meditate. He hears me talk about it all the time. The seeds are planted. Some point in his life, it may become an attractive option.
We sincerely appreciate you coming into our living room and having an honest conversation with us.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
It's really all about meeting Venus, right, buddy?
Yeah,
And-
she's our official mascot.
And real quick, tell our audience what you have going on and about the book, about the two books that you have that they could purchase.
Yeah, I wrote a book called 10% Happier. I wrote a follow-up called Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics, which is like a how-to book. And I have another book coming out, I don't know when, the next 12 to 18, 24 months, called Me, A Love Story, which is kind of about, how to develop the skill of love. And danharris.com has like my whole podcast community on it. So yeah, that's my big focus right now, is building danharris.com. Like, I've done so many episodes on the show, and I want to make a place for people to like go deeper on that stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. Appreciate
Thank
you.
you.
And Alex,
Appreciate
thank you for sitting through it. Appreciate you, man.
Cheers.
You want to say something?
No. No comment on this.
No comment.
You want to just mention you've got the best dad in the world?
You could say otherwise.